Hello folks, so welcome back to our recorded lectures for HI121. This is the Lion of India, Ashoka and the Maurya Empire. So this week's lectures kind of go together. They are looking at a pair of major figures, Ashoka in this lecture and Qin Shi Huang in the next lecture. Now, they're from roughly the same time in history, but they have very different methods and very different motives as leaders, and these have very different consequences for their respective states. One is what we would call a good ruler. The other is, I don't want to say bad, maybe terrifying, but they make for a useful comparison, especially since in both cases their dynasty ended not long after they died. They both speak to the challenge of maintaining complex states in the ancient world. So before we look at Ashoka himself, we have to look at some of the background leading up to him. And this actually means beginning with Alexander the Great. I want to bring us back to his time in India because the Mauryas are the dynasty that basically follows him. Alexander's not really as significant to Indian history as you might expect. His support was actually relatively slight amongst Indian rulers. Those who supported him were exceptions rather than the rule. There is a famous battle in 326, the Battle of the Hydaspes. This is where Alexander crosses the Indus River under cover of a thunderstorm. He attacks Porus, a local king, and defeats his war elephants. He was impressed by Porus and enlisted him as an ally to rule as satrap over the territory. Now, Porus is one of the exceptions who did wind up supporting Alexander, although he certainly didn't start there. There's a rather remarkable non-exception I feel I should mention, because there's also an Indian queen, Cleophas of Pushkalavati, who dies along with 7,000 of her soldiers, we are told, fighting Alexander in a battle where Alexander himself is actually wounded. Now, her people are the ancestors of the modern Pashtuns. Some Greek writers claim that she tried to seduce or marry Alexander. Indian writers consider this to be insulting romantic nonsense. Really, it's so typical of the Greeks. Look, an exotic and powerful woman. Of course she wants to kill or marry the Greek guy. Sorry, little sarcasm there, but it's a trend. We can't deny that. Now, Alexander and his troops head home before they have to fight the Nanda Empire directly. They've had enough of India and the East in general, and the fate of his empire is resolved elsewhere. But, despite the fact that he doesn't manage a lasting conquest, Alexander does contribute to a general destabilization of the northwest part of India and the Punjab, and this creates a great deal of political upheaval. So basically what he does is he leaves the door open for the rise of the Mauryas. But he himself is more or less a footnote in Indian history. He's almost more significant because his contact with them provides information about India to the west, and it serves as the basis of Western knowledge on the subject until the Middle Ages. Alright, to introduce you to the Mauryas, I have to introduce you to an important Indian scholar, we believe of the 4th century BCE, and you will be reading a little bit of his work this week. His name is Chanakya, which is sometimes rendered as Kautilya. This is traditionally thought to have been his actual name versus his pen name. Small note, there is some debate over the time that this text was written and what role Chanakya actually played in its authorship. For the purpose of the lecture, we are going with the majority opinion, but know that there's a bit of a debate. So the famous text is the Artha Sastra, which is an important treatise on politics and diplomacy. It talks about how a king can amass power by playing states against each other. Sometimes it's compared to The Prince by Machiavelli. But the ultimate goal for Chanakya was always the betterment of the state. So it's important to recognize that as much as he does point out that violence is sometimes required as the tool of the state, he also has a lot to say about social welfare. He talks about land reform, the protection of the vulnerable, how to deal with famines. It's a very comprehensive book on how exactly a government should be run in India. He even has details on how to manage natural resources. So, forests are where elephants live. We like elephants because they can be made into elephant cavalry. Don't cut down the forests. Now, he seems to have a problem with the Nanda Empire. He thought they were poor rulers. And so he visited many of the kings of the Northwest, and he organized a new confederacy, or helped to organize a new confederacy, under his prize student, who's called Androkotos in the Greek tradition, but whose name is actually Chandragupta Maurya, who overthrows the Nanda and creates a new state in 321 BCE. We don't know a lot about his life or the process of his initial conquest. Some sources claim that he started off by fighting the outposts that Alexander had left along the Indus River. We do have a few significant bits and pieces. So we know, for instance, he has sort of an epic confrontation with Seleucus Nicator in 305 BCE. Seleucus came east to try and claim Alexander's original territory in India, and Chandragupta met him and stopped him cold. It may not even have been a battle. Probably would have been a little stupid of Nicator to actually fight him, because he had thousands of war elephants, we are told. So the treaty involved the Seleucids ceding all territories east of Kabul to the Maurya. So this means that the Mauryan border was the same as what we see 2,000 years later at the height of the Mughal Empire. And in return for this, apparently Chandragupta gave Nicator something like 500 war elephants. Now, interestingly, the treaty was also supposedly sealed with the marriage of a daughter of Nicator into the royal house of the Maurya, possibly to Chandragupta's son. So here's the question: does that make Ashoka part Greek? It is the Greek accounts that talk about this, not the Indian, so it's impossible to know if it's true. Now, scholars have made a lot of hay out of Ashoka's use of Greek in some of his inscriptions, but that's a stretch. I mean, given Alexander's activities and the history of the Indo-Greek kingdoms, there could definitely have been Greek-speaking populations amongst the Maurya's subjects, hence inscriptions in Greek. Now, towards the end of his life, Chandragupta becomes very spiritual, and he abdicates in favor of his son. He becomes a monk, and he fasts himself to death, following the Jain tradition. Now, this is something that's only done under specific circumstances. So if you're very old, if you're ill, if you have no responsibilities or future plans left, and your family has to support it. Now, one of our other major sources for this earlier period is Megasthenes, who was a Greek ambassador from the Seleucids. He visited the Maurya court in around 300 BCE. His work, which is called Indica, was mostly lost, but there are some extracts of it that survive. And he talks about the capital city of Pataliputra and describes its fortifications. If he is describing it accurately, the city was about twice the size of Rome under Marcus Aurelius, and it would have been the largest city we know of in the ancient world. Now he talks about the social structure, about how opulent the royal court was. He thought that it compared very favorably with the Seleucid court. He claimed that artisans and soldiers were supported directly by the state, that all land belonged to the emperor, and that there was a thriving spy system that reported on everything. Very interesting, because all of this goes along beautifully with what Chanakya said rulers should do in the Arthashastra. Now, the most notable of Megasthenes' observations might be the size of the military. Well, he doesn't give numbers. He suggests that it's huge. And other sources from later in the Maurya period suggest that we're looking at hundreds of thousands of people in the standing army, believe it or not. I always caution about taking numbers without a grain of salt, but this is one of the few cases where it may actually be true. Alright, so a little bit about Mauryan administration. They combined a centralized government with autonomous villages and a whole hierarchical system of officials overseeing larger and larger groups of villages. So giving you a few examples there, like the Gopa would oversee 10 to 20 villages. Then there'd be a group of 100 to 200 above him, overseen by Sthaniya. And then the Sthaniya would report to Sthanika, who may have been a member of the royal family. Now, at the level of Sthaniya, and I'm probably mispronouncing these, you see responsibility for the maintenance of law and order, the administration of justice, and the land that wasn't covered by villages, because of course it can be hideouts for bandits. So there's a whole system of officials to deal with that. Mauryan administration is basically paternalistic in nature. It wanted to work for the welfare of its people, both materially and spiritually. Taxes were very high and complex. There was a land tax that could be even higher in times of emergency. Fines were collected by the court. Tolls and customs duties were collected by another layer of the bureaucracy. And professional taxes were paid by groups like artisans, fishermen, foresters, and mine workers. Now, at the executive level, you had the king, but you also had a council of ministers, and there were 18 heads of departments, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce that, as well as the head priest, the chief of the armed forces, the heir, the chief of police, the keeper of forts, the head of the royal household. There is a mentrina, which is, we think, a chief minister, but the king is ultimately in command. And Pataliputra had its own administration, as did other cities. And in general, what we see are huge social welfare programs. All right, so get a load of this. The Mauryans had homes for the elderly, for the disabled, for orphans. They had regular programs for famine relief, programs to aid refugees, programs to aid the sick during epidemics. They had agricultural development programs to help peasants with seeds and cattle if they'd had a bad season. They had pension systems for those working in temples or religious organizations. They had systems for aid to traders or artisans who might find themselves in difficulty. It is incredibly comprehensive. Now, that being said, there's also a lot of regional variation in government. We can't see it clearly because we don't necessarily have the best sources. This is still, the 3rd century BCE. There is some suggestion that some areas would have been a lot more centralized than others. Some areas are just under minimal control because they're just not as significant. So, if you got a forested area, as long as they keep sending timber, minerals, and elephants, the central government is probably good with whatever they choose to do. Whereas areas with large trading towns would have had much more complex relationships. The social ethic is universal. The amount of administrative control over the population is adjustable. That's basically the summary. Alright, now we actually get to Ashoka. So, Mauryan history between Chandragupta and Ashoka is rather hazy. There is a lack of sources and a lack of detail on just how the conquest of territory proceeded. Only when we get to Ashoka do we have better documentation. So Ashoka ruled in 273 to 231 BCE. He is generally considered to be the greatest ruler of ancient India, an excellent warrior, and an excellent administrator. Now, as a young man, he was made governor of Taxila, which is the site of the famous university, and so he got some administrative experience early. But according to Buddhist sources, his reign begins very poorly. He usurps the throne and kills all his rivals. Now, should we believe this? Not necessarily. Because if you make this kid look real bad, then he's a better candidate for enlightenment a little later on. And that's important, as we will get to. Now, the reason I bring that up is because of the stories surrounding Ashoka and the Kalinga War. So 13 years after his accession to the throne, starting in 260 BCE, he fights a war against a neighboring republic, Kalinga. He's trying to annex it. There's apparently a massive battle where tens of thousands of people are killed on either side. And the aftermath is apparently just as brutal. Now, he is supposedly approached by a woman who says, "I've lost my husband and son, so what do I have to live for?" And the experience of this, we are told, was enormously traumatic for him, and he is intensely remorseful. He decides at that point that he's going to stop conquering his neighbors, and instead try and resolve disputes through diplomacy. Now, in one of his edicts, which were recorded in stone all around the country, he records this shift in his perspective. He talks about how he's begun to believe in righteousness, and that he would be grieved if he ever caused this sort of tragedy to happen again. Now, is that rhetoric? Probably, but it's really unusual rhetoric. Like, for the time, this is not the model for kingship that we usually see in the 3rd century BCE. Now, his inscriptions, his edicts are interesting. As I said, they're all over the place. There are some that are in the Prakrit language, others in Greek or Aramaic. Depends on what part of his kingdom the inscriptions are found in. They are the oldest Indian written documents. Now, they were discovered and translated by a scholar, James Prinsep, in the 1830s, and they give us a snapshot into his administration and his way of thinking about politics. Now, the earlier edicts are usually carved into rock faces, but later they are actually carved into purposefully built sandstone pillars. The pillars are adorned with capitals, usually animals. The 4 lions, the lion capital, which you saw in the opening slide, has been adopted by post-colonial India as its national symbol. We'll see some examples of that at the end of the lecture. Now, in general, the inscriptions recorded his instructions to his officials and to the public, his attempt to set an example of enlightened governance. We know that he had officials called Dharma Mahamatras, who toured the empire enforcing regulations that were based on compassion to humans and to animals. Yes, because Ashoka had adopted an important element of Buddhist thought, ahimsa, or nonviolence. So he actually banned traditional practices of animal sacrifice, and actually also some killing of animals for food. We are told that he himself preferred a vegetarian diet. He actually gave up hunting for pleasure, encouraged his courtiers to do the same. He wanted them to go on pilgrimage to Buddhist holy sites instead. We are told he planted trees along the roads, he dug wells, he created rest houses, he built hospitals for both humans and animals, he even encouraged medical research, Ayurveda. But here's the question, was he himself Buddhist? Well, unsurprisingly, that's a tricky answer. So some scholars argue that he was in fact a Buddhist, that he became a monk. Others say, no, he was a lay member of the religion. I mean, he practiced pilgrimage, he celebrated Buddhist festivals, but he wasn't actually a monk. Probably the most appropriate thing to say is that he was heavily influenced by Buddhism. I mean, Ashoka was more interested in morality. He drew on various religious traditions. He was enormously tolerant of all religions, and he did have a special sympathy for Buddhism, and he did help it spread both inside and outside India. So, for instance, he sends his son Mahinda to Sri Lanka, which later converts to Buddhism. And in the Sri Lankan tradition, they claim that it was Ashoka's influence that caused them to do that. He is said to have sent another son or perhaps a daughter to Myanmar to spread Buddhism there. Now, missionary work was fairly widespread in the Northwest. Buddhism spread into Central Asia and eventually into China via the Silk Road. Now, there's some indication that his attempts to mandate morality were resisted. One of his inscriptions is really interesting in that regard. It says, virtuous deeds are difficult to accomplish. He who tries to accomplish them faces a hard task. And there's another inscription that indicates his neighbors were maybe a little nervous about him still, possibly due to the stories about Kalinga. And I'm going to just read you the translation of the inscription here. It may occur to my unconquered borderers to ask, what does the king desire, with reference to us? This alone is my wish, with reference to the borderers, that they may learn that the king desires this, that they may not be afraid of me, but may have confidence in me, that they may obtain only happiness from me, not misery, that they may learn this, that the king will forgive them what can be forgiven. Again, rhetoric, yeah, but this is not like anything we have from a king of Ashoka's nature before. You know, this is somebody who's taken a very different approach to leadership. Now, whatever his specific religious leanings, he was a realist. And he probably understood, how futile constant expansionism could be. So he may have seen the Buddhist sort of spiritual infrastructure as a way to legitimize his new doctrine of right conduct and to give some stability to his empire. So think about it for a little bit. How seriously do you think we should take statements like this? I mean, he's so different from the traditional warrior king that we see so often. I mean, in most cases they're like, don't cross me or I will wreak a horrible vengeance upon you. That's more typical. But presuming Ashoka was serious about his nonviolent approach, how could he afford to take this approach? There's a lot of really good questions to ask about Ashoka. And yes, I somehow managed to cut off the head of that statue. You can appreciate the art involved in the figure itself, I suppose. So the empire falls within 50 years of Ashoka's death in 231 BCE, likely due to succession issues. Sorry, I went back and I shouldn't have. Let me just get back to where we were. The last Maurya king, Brihadrath, was overthrown by one of his own generals and assassinated in 185. Probably certain provinces had already become independent after Ashoka's death, including Kalinga. The dynasty only lasts 136 years. It is replaced by the Shunga dynasty, which preferred a different region of India as its center of power. So Pataliputra basically started to decline. And the Shunga are not able to hold together the complex bureaucracy or administration of the Maurya. They had to divide it into a sort of feudal arrangement, and this sort of pattern becomes the norm. Now, meanwhile, because of political consolidation in China, which does tend to push people around, there are frequent invasions of the northern territories by Central Asian groups. Now, climatic change may also have been an issue, because it would have driven nomads out of their traditional territories, looking literally for greener grass. Now, how do we assess the Maurya? Is it a brief but remarkable experiment? I mean, their successors do roll back some of their cultural changes. A lot of them, actually. They revived animal sacrifice, maybe even human sacrifice. They reintroduced old festivals. They didn't suppress Buddhism. They even helped build new monasteries, so that part of Ashoka's work seems to have held. We have to ask ourselves, why do the Maurya hold so much significance to the Indian historical imagination? Alright, so I mentioned that the lion capital was a symbol of post-colonial India, and Ashoka in particular plays a very significant role in modern India and how it sees itself. Nehru, who was the first PM of India in the 1940s, talked about the role that he believed India had to play in the nuclear world, how it should lead Asia into a role where it could contribute to furthering peace. Now, while he was in prison, because all post-colonial leaders spent their time in prison, he had studied Indian history, and he was trying to figure out where he could find a historical precedent for the India he wanted to create. Now, what attracted him to Ashoka? Probably, despite the fact that Ashoka was a king, which Nehru wouldn't have liked very much, he was trying to be a good person. He was properly religious. He was worthy of admiration. His empire encouraged people to become better. So Nehru actually quotes the Ashokan edicts in one of his famous letters from jail. He seems to have identified very significantly with him. Now, while he believed there were thousands of years of continuity in Indian history, that was part of his image of the nation and its culture, he saw Ashoka as a sort of high water mark. He admired him for his apparent behavior in the aftermath of the Kalinga War, for the fact that he didn't even try to conquer the rest of the pieces of the subcontinent that were outside of his control. Nehru appreciated his anti-war stance. Now, he himself, Nehru, was actually depicted by some as a cultural reincarnation of Ashoka. Now, unfortunately, India fights a losing war with China in 1962, and it hammered home that this was sort of romantic idealism. India had to be a military power if it was to survive. But Ashoka still captures the Indian imagination. The lion capital still shows up on stamps and on coins. And the idealism, I would argue, is probably still there. It's just beneath the surface. Okay, that should do it for Ashoka. I should be back shortly with Qin Shi Huang.